The Arizona sun had barely crested the eastern mountains when Sarah began her morning routine, drawing water from the well that her father had dug years before his fever took him. The trading post had been her family's dream once, positioned strategically along a route that promised steady traffic between settlements. But dreams died easily in the desert, and now at 16, Sarah found herself the sole occupant of buildings that grew more weathered with each passing season. Her mother had succumbed to illness 2 years after her father, leaving Sarah with little choice but to remain in the only home she had ever known, surviving on what she could grow in her stubborn garden and the occasional traveler, who still stopped seeking supplies or water. The storage shed behind the main building had become a repository for items too damaged to sell but too potentially useful to discard completely. Sarah rarely ventured inside except when searching for specific tools or materials, so she was surprised that morning to hear a sound emanating from within, a low groan that was distinctly human rather than animal. Her first instinct was fear, followed quickly by caution as she approached the shed door with a heavy walking stick she kept for protection. The Arizona territory was dangerous for anyone, but especially for a young woman living alone without family or nearby neighbors to call upon for help. She pushed open the door slowly, allowing sunlight to penetrate the dim interior, cluttered with broken wagon wheels, worn leather goods and miscellaneous supplies her parents had accumulated. At first she saw nothing unusual, but then movement in the far corner caught her attention. A man lay partially concealed behind a stack of crates, and as her eyes adjusted to the shadows, Sarah realized with shock that he wore the distinctive clothing of a Lakota warrior. His buckskin shirt was torn and stained dark with dried blood, and heavy iron shackles bound his wrists together with a short length of chain. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she processed what she was seeing. The man was clearly injured severely, his breathing shallow and labored. Someone had brought him here, or he had dragged himself here seeking shelter, and whoever had shackled him had apparently intended to leave him to die slowly in this forgotten shed. The cruelty of such an act struck her even as her mind raced through the dangerous implications of this discovery. The military had been conducting operations against various tribes, and finding a Lakota warrior on her property could bring serious trouble regardless of the circumstances. The warrior's eyes opened slightly, focusing on her with difficulty. He made no aggressive movement, perhaps because he lacked the strength, or perhaps because he recognized that she held his fate in her hands at this moment. Sarah stood frozen, gripping her walking stick, trying to decide what to do. Every practical consideration screamed at her to report this immediately, to distance herself from a situation that could easily destroy what little security she still possessed. Yet as she looked at the wounded man lying helpless before her, she could not shake the image of her own father in his final illness, dependent on the mercy and care of others. She made her decision quickly. Before rational thought could overrule instinct, Sarah returned to her living quarters and gathered what supplies she could spare: a blanket, a cup of water, and most significantly, half of the bread she had baked the previous day. Her food stores were limited, carefully rationed to last until her garden produced more vegetables, but she could not simply ignore someone starving regardless of who they were or what they represented. She carried these items back to the shed, approaching the warrior cautiously. While speaking in quiet tones, she hoped might convey non-threatening intent, even if he could not understand her words. The warrior watched her approach with wary confusion, clearly expecting harm rather than assistance. When Sarah knelt beside him and offered the water, he hesitated before drinking deeply, his thirst overcoming suspicion. She then broke the bread into smaller pieces and held one out to him. His eyes met hers with an intensity that made her realize this simple gesture carried significance beyond the physical sustenance. He accepted the bread and ate slowly, and Sarah saw in his expression a flicker of something that might have been gratitude or perhaps simply acknowledgement of an unexpected kindness. She examined his injuries as best she could without touching him, inappropriately or causing additional pain. The wounds appeared to be from bullets and rough handling, but none seemed immediately life-threatening if they could be kept clean and allowed to heal. The shackles were another matter entirely. Heavy iron that had already rubbed his wrists raw, locked with a mechanism she had no means to open. Sarah realized that helping this man would require more than a single offering of bread and water. It would demand sustained care, secrecy, and risk she could barely begin to calculate. Yet, having started down this path, she found herself unwilling to turn back, even knowing the dangers that surely lay ahead. Over the following days, Sarah established a careful routine of tending to the wounded Lakota warrior, while maintaining the appearance of normal activity at her trading post. She visited the shed multiple times daily, bringing food, fresh water, and clean cloth for bandaging his wounds. The warrior remained weak, but gradually grew stronger under her care, though the shackles remained a constant problem she could not solve without proper tools or keys. She cleaned the raw skin around the iron bands as best she could, wrapping them with soft fabric to prevent further damage, aware that infection from those wounds posed as much danger as his other injuries. Communication between them existed initially only through gestures and expressions, yet Sarah found herself surprised by how much could be conveyed without shared language. She learned to read whether he was in pain by the tension around his eyes, whether he needed water by the way he looked toward her cup, whether he was grateful by the slight nod he gave when she brought food. In turn, he seemed to understand her caution, her fear, and her determination to help despite both. He made no threatening movements, offered no resistance to her ministrations, and gradually began attempting words in broken English that suggested he had encountered her language before. The warrior's name, as she eventually understood through his careful pronunciation, was Dakota, which he indicated meant friend to all in his language. Sarah found bitter irony in that name, given how he had been treated by those who had shackled and abandoned him. Yet she also recognized that it seemed fitting for someone who had accepted help from a stranger without hostility, despite having every reason to distrust anyone from her culture. She told him her own name in return, speaking slowly and clearly, and watched his lips form the unfamiliar sounds as he practiced saying it. As Dakota grew stronger, Sarah learned fragments of his story through a combination of his limited English, her patient questions and gestures that filled the gaps language could not bridge. He had been part of a small group traveling far from their traditional territories, seeking relatives who had been displaced by military actions. They had encountered a patrol that viewed all Lakota as hostile, regardless of actual intentions or actions. His companions had scattered when soldiers opened fire without warning, and he had been wounded, captured, and shackled. The soldiers had brought him to this area, intending apparently to return later, but had left him in Sarah's shed either as temporary holding or perhaps with the crueler intention of letting him die slowly while they attended to other duties. Sarah was horrified by this account, recognizing the casual cruelty it represented. She had heard stories of conflicts between military forces and various tribes, had listened to travelers speak of tensions and misunderstandings that escalated into violence, but she had remained largely sheltered from direct experience of such events. Her trading post existed in a kind of neutral space, visited by people from multiple backgrounds who generally maintained peace in her presence because she provided useful services without judgment or favoritism. Now that neutrality was compromised by her decision to help Dakota, and she understood that consequences would eventually arrive, regardless of how carefully she maintained secrecy. One afternoon, as Sarah was changing Dakota's bandages, she heard the distant sound of approaching horses. Her heart seized with fear as she quickly covered him with the blanket and instructed him through gestures to remain absolutely silent. She hurried from the shed, closing the door carefully, and arrived at the front of her trading post just as 3 soldiers rode into view. They were not the same men who had left Dakota in her shed, but they wore the same uniforms and carried the same authority. They stopped to request water for their horses and asked casually if Sarah had seen anyone unusual passing through the area recently. Sarah forced herself to appear calm as she provided water and responded that she rarely saw anyone at all, that her trading post served few travelers anymore, that she lived a very quiet and isolated existence. The soldiers seemed satisfied with her answers, though one of them glanced toward her outbuildings with casual curiosity that made her pulse race. They commented that she was very young to be living alone in such remote territory, that it was dangerous for a woman without protection, that she should consider relocating to a proper town where she would have community support and security. Sarah thanked them for their concern while deflecting their suggestions. And after what felt like an eternity, they finally departed, riding west toward the mountains. She waited until they disappeared completely from view before returning to the shed, where she found Dakota alert and tense, clearly having understood the danger, even without seeing the soldiers himself. Sarah's hands shook as she resumed her work on his bandages, the close call having driven home just how precarious her situation had become. She was harboring someone the military considered an enemy, providing aid that could easily be construed as treason or collaboration, risking everything for a person she barely knew. Yet even as these thoughts circled through her mind, she could not imagine making a different choice. Dakota had done nothing to her except accept her help gracefully, and abandoning him now would be a betrayal, not just of him but of the values her parents had tried to instill in her about treating all people with basic dignity. As weeks passed, and Dakota's injuries gradually healed, the dynamic between Sarah and the Lakota warrior evolved from simple caretaking into something resembling genuine communication and mutual respect. Dakota's English improved through their daily interactions, and Sarah learned a few words of Lakota in return, creating a hybrid language that served their practical needs while also building unexpected connection. He told her more about his people, describing their traditional ways of life that had been disrupted by expanding settlements and military campaigns. She shared stories of her parents, of growing up at the trading post, of the loneliness that had become her constant companion after their deaths. Dakota expressed confusion about why Sarah had chosen to help him when doing so clearly endangered her. He explained that in his experience, most white settlers viewed Lakota people as threats to be eliminated, rather than humans deserving compassion. Sarah admitted honestly that she had been frightened when she first found him, that she still carried fear about what might happen if his presence was discovered, but that she could not reconcile letting someone die when she had the means to prevent it. She told him about her father's teachings, that character was measured not by comfortable choices, but by difficult ones, that mercy mattered most when it was hardest to extend. The warrior listened carefully to her explanations, and after a long silence, he told her something that clearly cost him effort to articulate. He said that among his people, creating a debt of honor through saving someone's life established a bond that carried serious obligations and responsibilities. By giving him food when he was starving, by caring for his wounds when he was helpless, by risking her own safety for his benefit, Sarah had created a connection that he was bound to honor for as long as he lived. He could not repay such a debt simply by leaving once he was healed, but neither could he remain without bringing increasing danger to her. He was caught between competing obligations, and the conflict troubled him deeply. Sarah was moved by his earnestness, but also troubled by the implication that their situation had no good resolution. She asked what would happen when he was strong enough to leave, whether he would try to rejoin his people, whether the military would continue hunting him. Dakota explained that his scattered group had likely given him up for dead by now, that returning to them would require a long and dangerous journey through territory filled with patrols and hostile settlers. He had been considering instead trying to reach relatives who had relocated to reservation lands, though that path carried its own challenges and humiliations. The reservations were places of confinement and dependency, where proud people were reduced to waiting for government supplies and permission to live, according to traditions that predated the settlers by countless generations. They talked through these difficult realities. Sarah found herself increasingly troubled by the injustice of Dakota's situation. He had committed no crime, had threatened no one, had simply been traveling when soldiers decided his existence was itself provocation enough for violence. Yet now he faced a future with no good options, either risk death trying to reach his people or accept confinement on a reservation where his culture and autonomy would be systematically stripped away. The unfairness of such forced choices struck Sarah as fundamentally wrong. Yet she also recognized her own powerlessness to change systems much larger than herself. One evening, as Sarah brought Dakota his dinner, she found him attempting to work on the shackles using a piece of metal he had found among the shed's debris. The attempt was clearly futile. The locks required specific keys or professional tools to open, but his frustration was palpable. Sarah had an idea and told him to wait while she searched through her father's old workshop. After considerable searching, She located a set of lock-picking tools her father had kept for situations where travelers arrived with locked trunks or boxes they could no longer open. She had no idea if these tools would work on military shackles, but it was worth attempting. She returned to the shed with the tools and explained through gestures and words that she would try to pick the locks. Dakota watched with intense focus as Sarah worked carefully, her hands trembling slightly with nervousness and the delicate precision required. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, she felt something shift in the first lock mechanism. With a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet shed, the shackle opened. She quickly moved to the second lock, and with slightly less difficulty, managed to open it as well. The heavy iron bands fell away from Dakota's wrists, revealing raw, damaged skin that would take time to heal properly. For a moment, neither of them moved. Dakota stared at his freed hands, as if unable to believe the shackles were truly gone. Then he looked at Sarah with an expression mixing gratitude, relief, and something deeper that she could not quite identify. He flexed his fingers carefully, testing mobility that had been restricted for weeks, and Sarah saw tears forming in his eyes, though he clearly fought to contain them. He spoke in Lakota, words she could not understand but which carried obvious emotional weight, then repeated in English a phrase that seemed inadequate for what he was trying to express. "You give me life twice now." Sarah felt her own eyes burning with unexpected tears, moved by his reaction and by the realization of what she had just done. Removing those shackles meant Dakota could now leave, could attempt to reach safety, could escape the slow death that had been intended for him. It also meant that physical evidence of his captivity was gone, which might make it harder to prove he had been improperly detained if questions were asked. More immediately, it meant that the most visible symbol of his helplessness had been removed, transforming their dynamic in ways Sarah was still processing. He was no longer her patient or someone she tended out of charity. He was now a free man who chose to remain, at least temporarily, because of bonds that extended beyond simple necessity. With the shackles removed, Dakota's recovery accelerated noticeably. He could move more freely, could properly clean and care for his wrists, and could begin exercising his weakened muscles without the constant drag of heavy iron. Sarah brought him better food as his appetite returned, carefully managing her own limited supplies to ensure he received adequate nutrition to rebuild his strength. She also began allowing him slightly more freedom within the shed, clearing space so he could move around rather than remaining confined to one corner. The risk of discovery remained, but she judged that his healing required more than just survival. It required dignity and the ability to care for himself rather than remaining entirely dependent. As Dakota regained strength, he began insisting on reciprocating Sarah's care in whatever ways the constraints of his situation allowed. He could not venture outside during daylight hours when anyone might potentially see him, but he could help with tasks inside the shed. He repaired tools and equipment that Sarah had set aside as too damaged to fix, using techniques and knowledge from his own culture's practical traditions. He also began teaching her more of his language, explaining that communication created safety as much as secrecy did. If she understood more Lakota, she might better help him navigate dangers he could more easily identify than she could. Their conversations deepened as language barriers diminished. Dakota spoke about his childhood, about learning from his elders, about ceremonies and traditions that connected his people to the land in ways that were both spiritual and intensely practical. He described how Lakota culture emphasized balance and respect, for nature, for others, for the interconnectedness of all living things. Sarah listened with fascination, recognizing that much of what she had been told about tribal peoples bore little resemblance to the thoughtful, principled person she was coming to know. The disconnect between reputation and reality troubled her, forcing her to question other assumptions she had absorbed without examination. Sarah shared her own experiences of loss and isolation, admitting that she sometimes wondered whether maintaining her family's trading post made sense when so few travelers passed through anymore. She confessed her loneliness, her occasional despair about whether her life had purpose beyond simple survival. Dakota listened with the same focused attention she had given him, and when she finished, he offered perspective that surprised her. He pointed out that she had created sanctuary in a harsh environment, that her trading post represented neutral ground where different people could interact peacefully, that such spaces were rare and valuable precisely because they were difficult to maintain. Her choice to help him proved that principle still guided her actions, even when it carried significant personal cost. His words affected Sarah more deeply than she had expected, offering validation she had not realized she needed. She had been viewing her situation primarily through the lens of what she had lost rather than what she had preserved. Her parents' dream had not died entirely. It had simply changed form, maintained by her determined efforts even when circumstances made that maintenance seem futile. Dakota's perspective reminded her that meaning often came not from grand achievements, but from consistent choices to uphold values even when easier paths existed. One afternoon, as they worked together organizing supplies in the shed, Sarah heard horses approaching again. This time there were more riders, and their voices carried clear purpose rather than casual conversation. Her stomach clenched with dread as she recognized the tone. This was not a simple patrol passing through, but rather people looking for something specific. She quickly signaled Dakota to hide in the space they had prepared for such emergencies, then smoothed her dress and forced herself to walk calmly to the front of her trading post to greet whoever had arrived. 6 soldiers sat mounted before her buildings, led by a stern-faced lieutenant who dismounted and approached her with formal courtesy that felt more threatening than friendly. He introduced himself as Lieutenant Morrison and explained that they were conducting a thorough search for a dangerous Lakota warrior who had escaped custody several weeks prior. Intelligence suggested he might be hiding in this general area, and they were investigating all properties and structures that could potentially conceal someone evading capture. The lieutenant's eyes were sharp and assessing as he spoke, clearly evaluating Sarah's reactions for any sign of deception. Sarah felt her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the soldiers must hear it, but she forced her voice to remain steady as she responded that she lived alone, that she rarely saw anyone at all, that her property consisted of only a few small buildings that were welcome to search if they believed it necessary. The lieutenant accepted her offer immediately, assigning soldiers to examine her living quarters, the storage areas, and most frighteningly, the shed where Dakota was currently concealed. Sarah maintained her composure through sheer willpower, walking with them as they conducted their search, answering questions about her situation and background, while her mind raced with terror about what would happen when they found him. The soldiers searched her living quarters first, examining every space large enough to conceal a person. They were thorough but not destructive, clearly following orders to be respectful of civilian property while still conducting an effective investigation. Sarah's mind worked frantically, trying to calculate how long Dakota had to prepare before they reached the shed, whether the hiding space they had created would actually withstand professional scrutiny, whether this was the moment when her compassion would finally bring consequences she could not escape. The lieutenant kept her engaged in conversation while his men searched, asking about her family history, her reasons for remaining in such isolated territory, her observations about unusual activity in the area. Finally, inevitably, the soldiers approached the shed. Lieutenant Morrison asked Sarah to open it, and with trembling hands that she hoped he would attribute to nervousness about soldiers invading her property, she complied. The door swung open, revealing the cluttered interior filled with damaged goods and miscellaneous supplies. The soldiers entered carefully, spreading out to examine different sections. Sarah stood in the doorway, forcing herself to breathe normally, watching them move through the space where she knew Dakota was concealed, somewhere among the shadows and accumulated possessions. Every second felt like an eternity as they searched, moving crates, examining dark corners, testing the stability of stacked materials. The soldiers completed their search of the shed without discovering Dakota, though Sarah could not fathom how the hiding place had remained undetected under such thorough examination. Lieutenant Morrison seemed frustrated by the lack of findings, clearly having expected this search to produce results based on whatever intelligence had directed him to her property. He questioned Sarah more aggressively, asking if she had noticed anyone lingering near her buildings, whether she had found evidence of someone taking supplies, if she had observed tracks or disturbances that might indicate a person moving through her property. Sarah maintained her denials, insisting that she would have reported any such observations immediately out of concern for her own safety. The lieutenant finally accepted her statements with visible skepticism, warning her that harboring fugitives was a serious crime that would be prosecuted to the fullest extent, regardless of any sympathies or misguided compassion she might feel. He emphasized that the Lakota warrior they sought was dangerous and not to be trusted, that any assistance provided to him would be viewed as active collaboration with an enemy combatant. Sarah nodded understanding, while privately rejecting his characterization entirely, knowing from direct experience that Dakota posed no threat to her, and that the only danger in her situation came from the soldiers themselves and the system they represented. After the patrol finally departed, Sarah waited a full hour before returning to the shed, ensuring they had truly left, rather than watching from a distance. She found Dakota emerging from an incredibly cramped space, beneath a false floor her father had apparently constructed years ago for secure storage of valuable goods. She had forgotten entirely about that hidden compartment until Dakota had discovered it during his explorations of the shed and recognized its potential as an emergency hiding place. His quick thinking and her father's old paranoia about theft had combined to save them both from discovery. But the close call left Sarah shaking with delayed reaction. Dakota could see her distress and spoke gently in English that had improved remarkably over their weeks together. He told her that she had been incredibly brave, that her calm response to the soldiers had been the difference between successful deception and catastrophic discovery. He also acknowledged that their situation had become increasingly untenable, that the military was clearly committed to finding him, that each search brought heightened risk, not just of his capture, but of serious consequences for Sarah. He could not in good conscience continue allowing her to take such dangers on his behalf, especially when he was now strong enough to travel and attempt reaching safety on his own. Sarah recognized the logic in his argument, but found herself reluctant to accept his departure as inevitable or imminent. She had grown accustomed to his presence, to their daily conversations, to feeling less alone in a way she had not fully acknowledged even to herself. More than that, she felt deeply uncertain about his chances of successful escape through territory, now saturated with soldiers actively hunting him. Yet she also understood that staying created risks that escalated with each passing day, that eventually their luck would run out, and that when it did, the consequences would be severe for both of them, but especially for her given her vulnerability as a young woman living alone without family protection. They agreed to carefully plan his departure, waiting for optimal conditions and preparing supplies that would give him the best possible chance of reaching his intended destination. Over the next several days, Sarah gathered food, water containers, warm clothing, and a good knife from her father's old collection. Dakota prepared himself physically and mentally for the difficult journey ahead, exercising to rebuild stamina and studying the terrain through careful observation from the shed's small window. They discussed routes and strategies, with Dakota teaching Sarah about tracking and evasion techniques that might help him avoid patrols. The night before his planned departure, they sat together in the shed speaking quietly. Both aware that this might be their final conversation, Dakota expressed his gratitude more fully than he had managed previously, explaining that Sarah had given him not just physical survival, but also renewed faith that goodness could exist across cultural divides, that compassion was not limited to one's own people. He promised that he would remember her always, that if circumstances ever allowed, he would find ways to honor the debt he owed her. Sarah tried to respond, but found herself unable to speak past the emotion closing her throat, managing only to nod acceptance of his words. At dawn, Sarah woke to sounds of multiple horses approaching rapidly. Her heart sank with terrible certainty, even before she looked outside to see not 6 but more than 20 soldiers surrounding her property in a coordinated formation that left no escape routes. This was not another search patrol, but rather a deliberate operation based on specific intelligence. Someone had informed on them, or perhaps the military had been watching more carefully than she realized, waiting for the right moment to act. Lieutenant Morrison dismounted and approached with grim determination, flanked by armed soldiers whose posture made clear they expected potential resistance. The lieutenant announced that they had reliable information that Sarah was harboring the fugitive Lakota warrior, that her continued denials could no longer be tolerated, and that she was under arrest for providing material support to an enemy combatant. Sarah protested that she had done nothing wrong, that her property had been searched thoroughly just days earlier with no findings, but Morrison cut her off sharply. He ordered soldiers to conduct another search, while two men moved to physically restrain Sarah. She struggled instinctively as they grabbed her arms, fear and anger overwhelming rational thought. This could not be happening, not after they had been so careful, not when Dakota was planning to leave today anyway. The soldiers dragged her toward their horses, while others began a more aggressive search than the previous one. Pulling apart her storage areas and examining every possible hiding place with systematic determination, Sarah watched in horror as they approached the shed, knowing that Dakota was inside, that discovery was now inevitable, that her attempt to help him had failed catastrophically. She called out a warning in Lakota, words Dakota had taught her, hoping he might hear and understand that he needed to run immediately, regardless of the odds against successful escape. The shed door crashed open and soldiers poured inside. Sarah heard shouts, sounds of struggle, and then Dakota was hauled out into the morning light, restrained by multiple soldiers who seemed to be taking no chances despite his weakened condition. His eyes found Sarah's across the distance between them, and in that brief connection she saw apology, gratitude, and resignation. He did not fight against his captors, perhaps recognizing futility, or perhaps unwilling to create additional problems for Sarah by forcing a violent confrontation. The soldiers shackled him again with fresh iron chains, and Lieutenant Morrison surveyed his captured prisoners with cold satisfaction. Morrison announced that both Sarah and Dakota would be taken to the nearest military fort to face appropriate charges and tribunals. Sarah would answer for her treason in providing aid to an enemy, while the Lakota warrior would be dealt with according to military justice. Sarah wanted to scream that none of this was just, that she had simply shown basic human compassion, that Dakota had never been their enemy, except in the narrow definitions of bureaucrats and soldiers who saw only threats rather than people. But her voice failed her as soldiers lifted her onto a horse, her hands bound, her future suddenly as uncertain as Dakota's own, both of them prisoners now because she had chosen mercy over obedience. The journey to the military fort took 2 days, during which Sarah and Dakota were kept separated, but remained visible to each other within the patrol formation. Sarah watched him carefully, noting how he held himself with dignity, despite the shackles and rough treatment from guards, who seemed eager to demonstrate their control over someone they viewed as a dangerous captive. He never complained, never showed weakness, and whenever their eyes met, he seemed to be trying to communicate something Sarah wished she could fully understand, perhaps reassurance, perhaps apology, perhaps simply acknowledgement of their shared predicament. At the fort, they were immediately separated, with Dakota taken to military holding cells, while Sarah was confined to a small room in the administrative building. A severe-looking woman was assigned to watch her, ensuring she could not escape or harm herself while awaiting formal proceedings. Sarah spent the first day in numb shock, unable to fully process how quickly her life had been overturned. She had been surviving alone, managing her trading post, existing in relative isolation but with at least the comfort of autonomy and familiar routine. Now she was a prisoner facing serious charges with no family to advocate for her and no resources to mount a proper defense. On the second day, Sarah was brought before a military tribunal consisting of 3 officers who would hear evidence and determine her fate. Lieutenant Morrison presented the case against her, describing how she had knowingly harbored a fugitive Lakota warrior, had lied repeatedly to military personnel conducting legitimate searches, and had provided material support that enabled an enemy combatant to evade justice. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling: her isolated property, her suspicious behavior during searches, and ultimately the warrior's discovery in her shed. Morrison argued that such actions could not be tolerated, that they represented a dangerous precedent that would encourage others to interfere with military operations against hostile tribes. Sarah was given opportunity to respond, and she spoke with more confidence than she felt, explaining her actions in the clearest terms she could manage, She described finding Takoda near death, shackled and abandoned without food or water. She emphasized that her decision to help him was based on basic human compassion, not political alignment or sympathy with any enemy cause. She pointed out that Takoda had never threatened her, had never been anything but respectful and grateful, and had been wounded while traveling peacefully rather than engaged in any hostile action. She challenged the tribunal to explain what they would have done in her situation. Would they truly have allowed another human being to die slowly when they had the means to prevent such suffering? Her words seemed to resonate with at least one of the three officers, a grey-haired colonel, who asked pointed questions about the circumstances of Takoda's initial capture and the decision to leave him shackled in Sarah's shed. Lieutenant Morrison appeared uncomfortable with this line of questioning, explaining that operational necessities sometimes required difficult decisions, that his men had intended to return for the prisoner but had been delayed by other urgent matters. The colonel's expression suggested he found this explanation inadequate, and he pressed further about whether proper procedures had been followed in the capture and detention of a tribal member who had not been actively engaged in hostilities. The tribunal adjourned to deliberate, leaving Sarah to wait anxiously for their decision. Hours passed with agonizing slowness, during which Sarah's mind raced through potential outcomes, ranging from lenient warnings to severe punishment. She thought about Takoda, wondered what proceedings he might be facing separately, hoped desperately that her attempt to help him would not result in his execution or other terrible fate. She also thought about her trading post, now abandoned and vulnerable to looters or destruction, everything her parents had built potentially lost because she had chosen compassion over self-preservation. When the tribunal reconvened, the grey-haired colonel served as spokesman. He acknowledged that Sarah's actions had technically violated military regulations regarding cooperation with fugitives, but he noted significant mitigating factors including her age, isolation, and the questionable circumstances of the warrior's initial detention. After considerable discussion, the tribunal had decided on a compromise resolution. Sarah would be released from custody, but would be required to abandon her trading post and relocate to a proper town where she could be part of a community that would provide appropriate oversight and support. She would be prohibited from any future contact with tribal members and would be monitored to ensure compliance with these conditions. Sarah felt relief mixed with profound loss. She would avoid serious punishment, but the cost was losing her home and the last physical connection to her parents. She started to ask about Takoda's fate, but the colonel cut her off, stating firmly that the warrior's situation was a separate matter, not subject to civilian inquiry. She was dismissed and escorted from the tribunal room, her questions unanswered and her concerns about the man she had tried to save creating an ache in her chest that competed with grief over her forced displacement. Sarah spent 3 days at the fort while arrangements were made for her relocation to a town called Prescott, several days' journey to the north. During this time, she remained confined to her room, but was treated with relative courtesy by the woman assigned to watch her. Sarah used these quiet hours to process everything that had happened, to grieve for the life she was losing, and to worry constantly about Takoda, despite having no information about what had become of him. She assumed he faced much harsher judgment than she had received, and the thought that her attempt to help might have ultimately made his situation worse haunted her sleepless nights. On the morning she was scheduled to depart for Prescott, Sarah was surprised when the grey-haired colonel, who had led her tribunal, requested to speak with her privately. She was escorted to his office, where he gestured for her to sit while maintaining a formal demeanor that suggested official business rather than casual conversation. The colonel studied her for a long moment before speaking, and when he did, his words surprised her completely. He explained that the Lakota warrior's case had presented unusual complications that required consideration beyond simple military justice. Investigation into the circumstances of Takoda's capture had revealed irregularities in Lieutenant Morrison's conduct, including the decision to leave a wounded prisoner shackled and unattended for an extended period without proper authorization or oversight. Additionally, testimony from Takoda himself, delivered through a translator, had provided a compelling account of his group's peaceful intentions and the patrol's precipitous use of force. The colonel stated that while military operations against hostile tribes were necessary and justified, treating all tribal members as enemies, regardless of their actual actions or intentions, contradicted both military regulations and basic principles of justice. The colonel continued, explaining that after considerable deliberation and consultation with his superiors, a decision had been made regarding Takoda's fate. Rather than facing execution or indefinite imprisonment, he would be released and provided with safe passage to reach his intended destination on reservation lands. This decision was based partly on the questionable circumstances of his capture, partly on evidence that he had committed no actual hostilities, and partly, the colonel paused, significantly, on Sarah's testimony about his character and the honor he had demonstrated even when helpless and dependent on the mercy of someone he had every reason to distrust. Sarah felt tears forming as she processed this unexpected information. She asked if she would be allowed to see Takoda before his departure, and the colonel considered the request carefully before nodding permission. He emphasized that such contact would be brief and supervised, that she should not interpret this allowance as undermining the conditions of her own release, but that he personally believed she deserved the opportunity to know that her compassion had not been entirely futile. Sarah thanked him with genuine gratitude, her voice breaking slightly as she struggled to contain the overwhelming emotions of relief and residual fear. An escort led Sarah to a courtyard area where Takoda waited under guard, his shackles finally removed, his wounds visibly healing though still marked by the ordeal he had endured. When he saw Sarah, his entire expression transformed, and she witnessed something she had rarely seen from him, an open smile that revealed how much her presence meant. They were allowed only a few minutes together, standing several feet apart with soldiers watching, but in that brief time they managed to communicate what mattered, most through the hybrid language they had developed and the deeper understanding that transcended words entirely. Takoda spoke first in careful English, telling Sarah that he had testified truthfully about everything that had happened, including her extraordinary kindness when she had absolutely no obligation to help him. He explained that he had made clear to the tribunal that she had saved his life at great personal risk, that she had treated him with dignity and respect when his own captors had shown him neither. He credited her testimony and character for influencing the colonel's decision to investigate the circumstances more thoroughly rather than simply applying standard military justice without consideration of context or nuance. Sarah responded that she had only done what felt right, that she could not have made different choices regardless of the consequences, that knowing he would survive and reach safety made everything worthwhile. She apologized for not being able to help him escape before the soldiers returned, for the additional suffering her inadequate concealment had caused. Takoda firmly rejected her apology, insisting that she had given him far more than physical survival. She had restored his faith that compassion could exist between people whom society insisted must be enemies. That individual character mattered more than collective prejudices. He reached into his shirt and carefully withdrew a small object that he had apparently been allowed to keep despite his captivity. It was a carefully carved piece of wood, smooth and polished, shaped into a distinctive bird in flight. Takoda explained that he had made it during his recovery in her shed, working on it during the long hours when she was attending to other tasks, using a small knife she had provided and scraps of good wood from her father's supplies. The bird represented freedom and hope, he told her, and he had intended to give it to her before his planned departure, as a token of gratitude and remembrance. The guards allowed him to approach close enough to place the carved bird in Sarah's hands, and as her fingers closed around the smooth wood, she felt the care and skill that had gone into its creation. The piece was beautiful despite its small size, capturing something essential about movement and possibility that transcended its simple materials. She looked up at Takoda, tears now flowing freely, and told him in Lakota, using words he had taught her, that she would treasure it always, that she would remember him and hope for his safety and happiness wherever his path led. Takoda responded in kind, mixing English and Lakota, promising that he would carry her memory with equal care, that he would tell his people about the young woman who had shown him that bridges could exist across seemingly impossible divides. He invoked the concept of honor debt again, explaining that among his people, such a bond was never truly discharged, but rather created permanent connection that transcended physical distance. Though they might never meet again in this life, they were linked by choices made and debts incurred. And that connection held meaning that time and separation could not erase. The guards indicated that their time was complete, and Sarah and Dakota were separated again, this time with the understanding that it was truly final. Sarah watched as he was led away toward the fort's gates, where horses and an escort waited to begin his journey to the reservation lands. He looked back once, raising his hand in a gesture of farewell and blessing, and Sarah returned it with her own trembling hand, clutching his carved bird against her chest with the other. Then he was gone, passing through the gates and out of her sight, carrying with him a chapter of her life that had been brief but transformative. Sarah was placed in a wagon the following morning for her own journey to Prescott, accompanied by a military escort and the stern woman who had been supervising her. As they departed the fort and began traveling north, Sarah took one last look back at the Arizona landscape that had been her entire world until this upheaval. The trading post her parents had built stood abandoned somewhere behind her, likely to fall into ruin or be claimed by others now that she had been forced to relinquish it. Everything familiar was being stripped away, and she was being transported to an uncertain future in a town where she knew no one and had no resources beyond what the military deemed appropriate to provide. Yet as the wagon rolled forward and the miles accumulated, Sarah found herself thinking not about what she had lost, but about what the experience had taught her. She had discovered reserves of courage she had not known she possessed, had maintained her principles even when doing so carried terrible costs, had formed a connection with another human being that had enriched both their lives despite the brevity of their time together. The carved bird she kept carefully wrapped in cloth represented more than just a gift from someone she had helped. It symbolized the possibility of understanding across boundaries that society insisted were absolute and insurmountable. The town of Prescott, when they finally arrived, proved to be larger and more established than Sarah's isolated trading post, with actual streets and multiple businesses and a community of people who seemed to know each other. She was delivered to a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Catherine Walsh, who had apparently been briefed on Sarah's situation and had agreed to provide housing and oversight as stipulated by the tribunal's conditions. Mrs. Walsh was a practical woman in her 50s who greeted Sarah with neither warmth nor hostility, simply acceptance of a new responsibility she had undertaken. Sarah's room at the boarding house was small but clean, with a window overlooking the main street and furnishings that were basic but adequate. Mrs. Walsh explained the house rules, the expectations for behavior and contribution to household tasks, and the reality that Sarah's presence was known to local authorities, who would be monitoring her compliance with the conditions of her release. It was not imprisonment exactly, but neither was it freedom in any meaningful sense. Sarah was being absorbed into a structured community where her independence would be significantly curtailed and her actions subject to ongoing scrutiny. In the days and weeks that followed, Sarah gradually adjusted to her new circumstances. She found work helping Mrs. Walsh with the boarding house operations, earning her keep through cooking, cleaning, and managing supplies. The work was familiar enough from her trading post experience, though the context was entirely different, with multiple residents to accommodate and social dynamics to navigate. Some of the other boarders were curious about her background, having heard rumors about the young woman who had been arrested for helping a Lakota warrior, but Mrs. Walsh discouraged gossip and maintained an atmosphere of respectful distance. Sarah made few friends initially, still processing her losses and uncertain how to present herself in a community that knew her story but understood nothing of the actual experience behind it. She kept Dakota's carved bird hidden in her room, taking it out occasionally to hold and remember those weeks in the shed, when two people from impossibly different worlds had found common ground in basic human decency. She wondered often where he was, whether he had reached his destination safely, whether he thought of her as she thought of him. The not knowing was difficult, but she accepted it as part of the cost of the choice she had made. Months passed, and Sarah gradually built a new life in Prescott. She earned the trust of Mrs. Walsh, who began giving her more responsibility in managing the boarding house. She developed cordial relationships with some of the other residents and merchants in town. She attended church services because it was expected and found some comfort in the community rituals, even if the theology often felt disconnected from her actual experiences. She was surviving, even functioning adequately, but a part of her remained forever changed by what had happened in that shed behind her family's abandoned trading post. One afternoon, nearly a year after her arrival in Prescott, Sarah was working in the boarding house kitchen when Mrs. Walsh called her to the front parlor. A visitor had arrived asking to speak with her, and Mrs. Walsh's tone carried a mixture of curiosity and caution that immediately put Sarah on alert. She smoothed her apron nervously and entered the parlor, to find an elderly Native American man waiting, dressed in a mixture of traditional and contemporary clothing, his weathered face carrying the marks of a long and difficult life. The man introduced himself through carefully spoken English as Red Cloud, an elder from the reservation community where Dakota had been sent after his release from military custody. He had traveled to Prescott specifically to find Sarah, carrying a message from Dakota and a responsibility that honor demanded he fulfill. Sarah invited him to sit, her heart racing with a mixture of hope and anxiety about what news he might bring. Mrs. Walsh hovered uncertainly in the doorway, clearly torn between propriety and curiosity, but Sarah gently asked for privacy, and the widow reluctantly withdrew. Red Cloud explained that Dakota had arrived safely at the reservation and had shared his story with the elders, speaking at length about the young woman who had saved his life despite having every reason to fear or reject him. The community had been moved by his account, recognizing that such acts of courage and compassion deserved acknowledgement and honor according to their traditions. Dakota had wanted to come himself, to express his gratitude more fully, but travel restrictions on reservation residents made such a journey nearly impossible without risking serious consequences from authorities who monitored tribal movements carefully. Instead, Dakota had asked Red Cloud, who occasionally traveled on community business, to find Sarah and deliver both his message and a gift that represented the debt of honor he still felt, despite the passage of time. The elder reached into his bag and withdrew a beautiful beaded necklace, the craftsmanship exquisite, and the pattern incorporating symbols that Red Cloud explained carried specific meanings: protection, gratitude, enduring connection, and hope for Sarah's future happiness. Dakota had made it himself during the long reservation evenings, pouring into the work all the things he could not say directly, creating something of beauty and meaning that would communicate across the distance that separated them. Sarah accepted the necklace with trembling hands, overcome by the thoughtfulness and effort it represented. Red Cloud continued, explaining that Dakota had adapted to reservation life as well as anyone could, that he was teaching younger people the traditional skills and knowledge that were in danger of being lost, that he spoke often of the lesson Sarah had taught him about humanity transcending cultural boundaries. He wanted her to know that her compassion had rippled outward in ways she could not fully perceive, that his testimony and example had influenced how others in his community thought about the possibility of understanding with those they had been taught to view as inevitable enemies. The elder also delivered a more personal message that Dakota had asked him to convey, that he thought of Sarah often, that he hoped her new life in Prescott was treating her kindly, that he carried her memory as a reminder of what was possible when people chose courage over fear and compassion over prejudice. He wanted her to know that she had given him not just physical survival, but renewed purpose and faith in a future that had seemed impossibly bleak during those dark hours when he lay shackled and abandoned in her shed. Her simple act of sharing bread had saved far more than his body. It had saved his spirit and his belief that goodness still existed in a world that seemed increasingly defined by cruelty and division. Sarah listened with tears streaming down her face, moved beyond words by learning that Dakota was well, and that her choice to help him had created meaning that extended beyond their brief time together. She asked Red Cloud to carry her own message. Back when he returned, that she was grateful for his visit, that she treasured both gifts he had brought, that she too remembered their time together, and drew strength from knowing that connection and understanding were possible even when everything in society worked against them. She wanted Dakota to know that sharing her bread had been the most important thing she had ever done, that she would make the same choice again despite all the costs it had carried, that he should never doubt the value of what they had created, together in that shed behind her family's forgotten trading post.